I arrived at Ashford Hall one October afternoon when the leaves were beginning to cover everything with their golden mantle, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and the last jasmines from the garden. If this kind of story moves you, stay with me until the end, because this is a confession I never thought I would speak aloud. I brought with me a small suitcase, 2 black dresses, and the certainty that my life, as I had known it, had ended 3 years ago when I buried Thomas in a cemetery I would never visit again. Nothing remained of the woman I had been. Only the trade that kept me alive, teaching to read, to write, to imagine worlds that I myself had stopped inhabiting. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, received me at the service entrance with a look that evaluated more than it said. She led me through long, silent hallways where the portraits on the walls seemed to follow me with ancient and severe eyes. The house smelled of beeswax, freshly cut firewood, and that particular silence of places where too many secrets have been kept. She showed me my room, small but dignified, with a window overlooking the back garden and a narrow bed covered with a blue wool blanket. She told me that the child, Eleanor, would be waiting for me the next day in the study room, and that Mr. Ashford rarely showed himself during the day. She did not need to say more. I understood immediately that this house was inhabited by ghosts that were not exactly from the other world, but from this one, from the living who have learned to walk without making noise. I met Eleanor before her father. She was 8 years old, with brown hair pulled back in braids too tight and eyes that seemed to contain a sadness improper for her age. She watched me from her chair by the window when I entered the study room, with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that was not distrust, but something worse, indifference. I spoke to her gently, asked her what books she liked, if she knew how to play the piano resting in a corner covered with dust, if she liked the flowers in the garden. She responded with monosyllables, without looking at me directly, as if she had learned that the people who came into her life did not stay long enough to matter. I decided not to force her. I opened the poetry book I had brought with me and began to read aloud without expecting her to listen. I read about birds flying south, about distant seas, about mothers singing lullabies under the moon. And when I finished, she was still looking out the window, but her hands were no longer so tightly clenched. Several days passed before I saw Mr. Ashford. I found him one early morning in the library, standing by a tall window with an open book in his hands that he did not seem to be reading. The light of dawn bathed him in a way that made him seem more a silhouette than a man of flesh and blood. He was tall, of firm but not robust constitution, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples and a posture that suggested both dignity and weariness. He did not hear me enter, or perhaps decided not to notice. I remained there, not knowing whether to retreat or announce myself, until he closed the book with a slow movement and turned toward me. His eyes were gray, the color of stones under rain, and they looked at me with an intensity that made me feel as if I had interrupted something sacred. I introduced myself with a firm voice, though my heart was beating fast. He barely nodded, pronounced my name as if testing it in his mouth, and then asked me how Eleanor was doing with her studies. I told him the truth, that she was an intelligent but distant child who needed time and patience. Something in his expression softened then, just a flash, and he nodded again before returning his attention to the window. I understood that the conversation had ended. I left the library with the feeling of having been seen in a way that no one had seen me in a long time. The days at Ashford Hall acquired their own rhythm, marked by lessons with Eleanor, silent meals in my room, and long afternoons when I wandered through the gardens when the weather permitted. Eleanor began to open up slowly, like a flower that fears the frost but cannot help turning toward the sun. She told me that her mother had died when she was 4 years old, that she barely remembered her face, but did remember her voice singing songs in French, and that her father never spoke of her. She showed me a small oil portrait that she kept in a drawer, a young woman of delicate beauty, with dark eyes and a smile that seemed to keep a secret. I asked her if she looked like her mother, and Eleanor shook her head, saying she looked like her father, that she had inherited his gray eyes and his tendency toward silence. We began to read together every afternoon, not only the texts I chose, but also the books she took from her father's library. Adventure novels, natural history treatises, collections of poems that smelled of old paper and faded ink. And sometimes, when we read, I felt a presence in the hallway, a step that stopped in front of the half-open door and then moved away without making noise. It was in November when Mr. Ashford began to appear more frequently. First casually, entering the study room to look for a book he said he needed, stopping to listen while I read aloud, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets. Then more deliberately, sitting in the corner armchair and asking permission with old-fashioned courtesy to listen to the lesson. Eleanor seemed to light up in his presence, as if her father's attention was a gift she rarely received. And I, who had learned to be invisible, who had perfected the art of not taking up space, found myself suddenly conscious of every movement, of every word I uttered, of the way his gaze rested on me when he thought I did not notice. It was not an improper or bold look. It was something more subtle and more dangerous. It was genuine interest, curiosity, something that seemed like recognition. One rainy afternoon, after Eleanor had retired to rest, he did not rise from his chair. We remained in silence for a long while, listening to the drumming of rain against the windows. Then he asked me where I came from, what had led me to accept this job so far from any city. I told him what I could tell, that I had been a teacher in a small school, that I had been married, that my husband had died of fever in the winter of 1887, and that since then I had lived teaching other people's children because I would have no children of my own. I said all this with a calm voice, without drama, because these were facts that no longer hurt me as much as they had left me empty. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly and said he understood what it was to live in a house full of absences. He spoke to me then, with measured and careful words, of his wife, of how she had died after a long illness that had consumed her slowly, of how Eleanor had been too small to understand why her mother disappeared day after day into that room on the upper floor from which she never emerged again. He told me that since then he had tried to be both father and mother, but that he did not know how to talk to a girl, how to teach her that the world could be beautiful despite everything. And in that moment, sitting before this man who had known privilege and wealth but also the deepest loss, I felt something I had not felt in years. It was not compassion nor pity, but a kind of painful affinity. The feeling that we both walked through similar territories, though on different paths. December arrived with frost on the windows and leaden skies. Eleanor and I decorated a small tree in the study room with velvet ribbons and paper figures she had cut out herself. Mr. Ashford watched us from the threshold, with an expression I could not decipher. On Christmas night, he invited me to dine with them in the main dining room, an immense room with a mahogany table that could accommodate 20 people, but that night held only 3. It was a strange and moving dinner, full of silences that were not uncomfortable, but contemplative. Eleanor spoke more than I had heard her speak in months, telling stories about the books we were reading, about the birds she saw from her bedroom window, about the dreams she had of traveling someday to places where it really snowed. Her father listened to her with absolute attention, and from time to time he looked at me as if he needed to confirm that I too was seeing what he saw, that his daughter was coming back to life. When Eleanor retired to sleep, he and I remained before the fireplace in the adjoining salon. He offered me a glass of wine that I accepted, though I rarely drank. We spoke of things without importance, of winter, of the gardens that would green again in spring, of books we had both read. And then, without transition, he asked me if I was happy at Ashford Hall. The question took me by surprise. I told him yes, that it was the most peaceful place I had been in a long time. He nodded, looking at the fire, and said in a low voice that he was glad, because there had been no peace in that house for years, and my presence, in some way he could not explain, had brought something of light. The months that followed were the strangest of my life. We established a routine that seemed natural, but was actually charged with a subtle tension, like a violin string tuned almost to the breaking point. Each morning I gave lessons to Eleanor, and almost every afternoon Mr. Ashford joined us, sometimes participating in the lessons, other times simply observing. He began to ask my opinion on books he was considering buying for the library, on ideas he had for improving Eleanor's education, on topics that had nothing to do with my function as governess, but that seemed to matter to him. And I, who had learned to keep my place, who knew the invisible rules that separated those who served from those who were served, found myself crossing lines I should not cross. I spoke to him with a frankness I used with no one, told him what I thought, even though I knew my opinion should not carry weight. And he listened, truly listened, as if my words mattered. It was in February when something changed. Eleanor had caught a severe cold that kept her in bed for a week. I spent most of the day in her room, reading to her, putting cold compresses on her forehead, watching over her restless sleep. Mr. Ashford entered several times a day, clearly worried though he tried to hide it. One night, when Eleanor's fever had finally subsided and she was sleeping deeply, I found him in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. He looked exhausted, defeated. I told him that Eleanor would be fine, that the worst had passed. He opened his eyes and looked at me with an intensity that left me breathless. He said my name, only my name, but the way he pronounced it contained so much that I had to look away. He thanked me, not only for caring for his daughter, but for being there, for not having left when it would have been easier to do so. And then, in a gesture that must have cost him all his self-control, he took my hand in his. It was a brief contact, almost chaste, but I felt its warmth pass through me, as if I had touched a flame. He withdrew his hand almost immediately, murmured an apology, and walked away down the hallway. I remained there, alone in the dimness, with my heart beating so hard I feared it could be heard throughout the house. After that night, we both became more careful. He avoided being alone with me, withdrew from the study room before Eleanor left, maintained a physical distance that had not existed before. And I did the same, aware that something had awakened between us that could not be allowed to grow. But the more we tried to ignore it, the more present it became. It was in the looks we exchanged when no one else was watching, in the conversations we started and left unfinished, in the charged silence that filled the space between us. I began to write letters I would never send. I wrote them in my room, by candlelight, pouring onto paper everything I could not say aloud. I wrote to him about what I felt when he entered a room, about how his voice had become the most comforting sound I knew, about the painful longing for something I knew was impossible. I kept those letters at the bottom of my trunk, beneath the clothes I never wore, as if they were confessions too dangerous to be destroyed, but too shameful to be read. Spring arrived with an explosion of color that seemed cruel in its beauty. The gardens of Ashford Hall filled with daffodils, tulips, and hyacinths that perfumed the air with their intoxicating sweetness. Eleanor, completely recovered, spent hours exploring every corner, drawing flowers in her notebook, creating herbaria with the plants she collected. Mr. Ashford had hired a new gardener, an older man who knew each species by its scientific name and who taught Eleanor about botany with infinite patience. I watched them from the window of the study room, feeling a strange mixture of joy at seeing Eleanor so alive and melancholy for something I could not name. One afternoon, Mr. Ashford appeared at my room with a bouquet of white roses. He said he had cut them from the garden, that he had thought perhaps I would like them. I took them with trembling hands, unable to hold his gaze. I thanked him with a barely audible voice. He remained at the threshold a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something more, and then left. I placed the roses in a vase on my table, and every morning when I awoke, the first thing I saw was their perfect whiteness, reminding me that there were beautiful things in the world, and that not all of them could be mine. It was in those days when I began to realize that the inhabitants of the house were watching us. Mrs. Caldwell looked at me with a mixture of disapproval and something that might have been compassion. The maids whispered in corners and fell silent abruptly when I passed. The new gardener greeted me with an exaggerated courtesy that seemed to conceal judgment. I understood that what I believed invisible was actually evident to anyone who wanted to see. And what was more terrifying, I understood that I did not care as much as I should. I had lived 3 years as a shadow, fulfilling my duty, keeping up appearances, not allowing myself to feel anything that could break the fragile equilibrium I had built. But something in this man, in this house, in this child, had awakened a part of me I believed dead. And now that it was alive, it hurt in a way I had never imagined. May brought intermittent rains and a humid heat that made clothing stick to the skin. Eleanor had progressed so much in her studies that we began to tackle more complex texts, French poetry I had learned years before, notions of astronomy we studied under the stars when the nights were clear. Mr. Ashford had bought a small telescope that we installed in the garden, and the 3 of us spent clear nights identifying constellations, tracing celestial maps, marveling at the immensity of the universe. Those nights were the happiest and the most painful. There was something in the darkness, in the intimacy of the 3 of us together under the infinite sky, that made the barriers between us seem artificial and absurd. He stood close to me to point out a star, and I felt the warmth of his body, the accidental brush of his sleeve against mine. Eleanor, oblivious to everything but her fascination with the stars, talked non-stop, asking questions that her father and I answered in turns, creating among the 3 of us a dialogue that flowed with the naturalness of something that had always existed. And when Eleanor finally retired to sleep, and he and I remained alone putting away the telescope, the silence that enveloped us was so charged with unspoken words we could barely breathe. One night, after one of those astronomy sessions, he stopped me as I was about to enter the house. He said my name in a low voice, and there was something in his tone that made me stop. He approached until he stood before me, so close I could see the small wrinkles around his eyes, the silver strands in his hair that shone under the moonlight. He told me he needed to speak with me, that there was something he had to say, though he knew he should not. My heart accelerated in such a way that I feared fainting. I asked him not to say anything, that some things were better left in silence. But he shook his head and said he had kept silent for too long, that life had taught him that things unsaid could weigh as much as things said. He confessed to me then, with a voice that barely trembled, that since my arrival at Ashford Hall, the house had ceased to be a tomb, that my presence had brought something he believed lost forever. He told me he knew it was improper, that I was in his employ, that any feeling between us would be seen as an unforgivable scandal, but that he could not continue pretending he felt nothing, that seeing me every day and having to maintain distance was a torture he could no longer bear. He said all this looking into my eyes, and when he finished, he remained motionless, waiting. I should have walked away. I should have remembered my place, the rules that governed our lives, the abyss that separated his world from mine. But instead, I told him the truth. I told him I felt the same, that I had tried to fight against it, that each day it cost me more to feign indifference. I told him I did not know what to do with what was happening to us, but that I could not continue denying it. And then, standing in that garden bathed in moonlight, he took my face in his hands with infinite delicacy and brought his forehead to mine. We did not kiss. It was something more intimate than a kiss. It was a mutual recognition, a surrender. The days that followed were impossible. We tried to behave normally, but everything had changed. Every casual encounter in a hallway, every conversation during Eleanor's lessons, every shared meal was charged with a tension that threatened to break us. He sought me with any excuse, asking my opinion on matters that clearly did not require my advice. I invented reasons to pass by the library at the hour I knew he would be there. We stole moments. A 5-minute conversation in the garden while Eleanor drew, a seemingly casual encounter in the hallway after everyone had retired, looks that lasted too long in the presence of others. And always, always, the knowledge that what we felt could have no future, that each moment together was a moment stolen from fate. It was Eleanor who, without knowing it, precipitated the crisis. One afternoon she asked me if I would always be her governess, if I would stay at Ashford Hall forever. I responded with evasions, telling her it depended on many things, that someday she would be too old to need a governess. She frowned and said something that pierced me like an arrow. She said she hoped that when that happened I would not leave, that she hoped her father would ask me to stay anyway, that she had noticed he was happy when I was near. I was left speechless, not knowing how to respond to that observation made with the disconcerting clarity of children. Eleanor continued, saying that her mother had died so long ago she barely remembered her, that it would not be wrong if her father found someone who made him smile again, that she would like to have someone like me always at home. She said all this with absolute innocence, without understanding the impossibility of what she suggested. I stroked her hair and told her that some things were more complicated than they seemed, but that I loved her very much and would do everything possible to stay as long as she needed me. That night, I could not sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, tormented by thoughts that chased each other without rest. Eleanor had put into words what neither of us had dared to seriously consider, the possibility of a future together. But that possibility was so loaded with obstacles it seemed more a cruel dream than a real hope. He was a gentleman, owner of properties, respected in the community. I was a widowed governess, a woman who lived by her work, without family, without fortune, without social position. If he decided to court me, if he tried to make public any kind of affection toward me, it would be seen as a scandal, a degradation of his position. And I, who had already lived the experience of love and loss, who knew the price of fleeting happiness, did not know if I was willing to risk the little stability I had managed to build for something that would probably end up destroying us both. June brought the heat of summer and a decision that changed everything. Mr. Ashford received a letter from his sister, who lived in London and whom Eleanor had not seen in more than a year. The woman planned to visit us for 2 weeks, bringing her own children so they could spend time with their cousin. Mr. Ashford seemed unenthusiastic about the idea, but accepted because he knew Eleanor would enjoy the company. When Lady Margaret arrived, I understood immediately that our small bubble of intimacy was about to burst. She was an elegant and sharp woman, with eyes that missed no detail and a tongue that could cut without needing to raise her voice. She evaluated me at the first meeting with a look that lasted barely 3 seconds and that classified, judged, and dismissed me as something without importance. During the following days, she observed the dynamics of the house with the attention of a hawk. She noticed how her brother spoke to me, how I responded, how Eleanor behaved with both of us as if we were a unit. And one afternoon, I heard her speaking with him in the library, with the door barely ajar. She was telling him it was improper, that people talked, that the servants had already noticed the excessive familiarity between him and the governess. She told him that Eleanor was at an impressionable age and that it was not appropriate for her to grow up seeing her father behaving inappropriately with an employee. She reminded him of his position, his responsibility to the family name, to the memory of his wife. And he, to my surprise and my pain, did not contradict her. I heard his voice, tense but controlled, telling her she did not understand the situation, that she had no right to judge. But I also heard the doubt in his tone, the way his arguments weakened before his sister's relentless attacks. She ended by saying that if he truly appreciated me, if he truly valued my well-being, he should let me go before the scandal ruined my reputation and made it impossible for me to find another decent employment. And after a long silence, he said he would think about it. I could not bear to hear more. I moved away from the library with my heart broken, taking refuge in my room. Lady Margaret's words reverberated in my head with the clarity of truth. She was right about everything. I had been selfish, allowing myself to feel what I felt, allowing that connection to grow, knowing it could lead nowhere. I had put at risk my position, my future, and what was worse, I had put at risk the reputation of a good man and the emotional stability of a child who had already suffered too much. That night, I made my decision. I wrote a letter of resignation, formal and polite, explaining that family matters obliged me to leave Ashford Hall. It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie. I left it on my table, ready to be delivered the following morning. But he arrived first. He knocked on my door past midnight when the whole house slept. I opened without thinking and found him in the hallway with disheveled hair and an expression of desperation I had never seen in him. He entered without asking permission, closing the door behind him. He told me his sister had left that very afternoon, that they had argued, that she had given him an ultimatum he had rejected. He told me he could not let me go, that he had tried to convince himself it was the right thing but he could not, that the idea of waking up without knowing I was somewhere in that house was unbearable to him. I showed him the letter I had written, and he took it, read it, and then tore it into small pieces that he let fall to the floor. He begged me to stay, that we would find a way to make it work, that he did not care what people said. And I, seeing this proud and reserved man completely stripped of his armor, told him that it did matter, that he had a daughter to educate, a position to maintain, a life to live that he could not sacrifice for feelings that might only be the product of loneliness. He tried to touch me and I stepped back. I told him that if he truly loved me, he must let me go, because staying would only bring pain for everyone. We spent the rest of the night talking, sitting on the floor of my room like two conspirators planning something impossible. He spoke to me of his marriage, of how it had been arranged by the families, of how he had learned to respect his wife but had never felt for her what he felt for me. He spoke to me of the years of loneliness after her death, of how he had learned to function without really living. And I spoke to him of Thomas, of how we had been happy despite our poverty, of how his death had left me empty in a way I believed permanent. I told him he had made me feel alive again, but that precisely because of that I had to leave, because I could not be the cause of his ruin or Eleanor's. When the first ray of light began to filter through the window, we stood up. He looked at me for a long moment, memorizing my face as if he knew it would be the last time we would be this close, and then he left without saying a word. The following days were an agony. We kept up appearances. He attended Eleanor's lessons as always. I taught with the same dedication as always. We spoke to each other with the formal courtesy expected between an employer and his employee. But everything was a farce, a cruel theater we performed for an audience that perhaps was not even paying attention. I had decided to stay until the end of summer, give Eleanor time to get used to the idea of my departure, and then leave before autumn turned the trees of Ashford Hall golden again. He had not mentioned that night again, but I saw in his eyes that the decision was killing him as much as it was killing me. July arrived hot and suffocating. Eleanor celebrated her 9th birthday with a small party in the garden attended by some children from neighboring properties. I watched her run and laugh, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding among the adults around her, and felt a mixture of relief and pain. She would be happy without me. She would find another governess, perhaps better than me, who would teach her everything she needed to know without bringing the weight of emotional complications. Mr. Ashford and I barely crossed paths during the celebration, but when our gazes met over the heads of the children, I saw in him the same desolation I felt. The night of my departure arrived a week later. I had packed my belongings with mechanical movements, putting each object in my suitcase as if burying parts of myself. The carriage that would take me to the station would come at dawn. I had not told Eleanor exactly when I would leave, only that soon I would have to go, and she had cried and begged me to stay until I promised I would write to her. I went to bed early, but could not sleep. I heard the nocturnal sounds of the house, the creaking of wood, the whisper of wind, the distant hooting of an owl, and then I heard footsteps in the hallway, stopping in front of my door. He did not knock. He simply remained there, on the other side of the wood, and I remained motionless in my bed, holding my breath. Minutes passed that seemed like hours, and then the footsteps moved away. I rose before dawn, when the sky was still dark. I went down with my suitcase, trying not to make noise. But he was there, waiting for me in the vestibule, completely dressed as if he had not slept all night. We looked at each other in silence. The carriage arrived, and the driver loaded my suitcase. It was time to say goodbye. He extended his hand, a formal gesture that seemed absurd after everything we had shared. I took his hand and held it a second longer than necessary. I thanked him for everything, for the opportunity, for his kindness, for letting me be part of Eleanor's life. He nodded, with his jaw clenched. And then, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he told me that if someday I changed my mind, if someday I decided it was worth trying despite everything, I knew where to find him. I told him I knew. I climbed into the carriage without looking back. The journey back to London was endless. I looked out the window without really seeing the landscape that passed. I thought about Eleanor, about her smile, about how she had flourished during those months. I thought about him, about his voice, about his gray eyes, about the way he looked at me as if I were something precious. I thought about the letters I had never sent him, that remained stored at the bottom of my trunk, mute testimony of feelings that would never find resolution. And I thought about myself, about the woman who had arrived at Ashford Hall empty and tired, and who left with a broken heart, but strangely alive. Months passed. I found work in another house, teaching the children of a merchant who had ambitions of ascending socially. It was a good job, well paid, with decent employers, but each day weighed on me like a sentence. The rooms were larger, the salary better, the responsibilities fewer. And yet, I felt as if I lived inside a faded painting. I received letters from Eleanor every 2 weeks, full of news about her studies, about the books she read, about the things she saw in the garden. She never mentioned her father directly, but I read between the lines, looking for some sign, some hidden message he might have asked her to include. It never came. Winter returned, and with it, nostalgia became unbearable. One night, alone in my room, I took out all the letters I had written and never sent. I reread them one by one, recognizing in each word the love I had denied, that I had smothered, that I had sacrificed on the altar of decorum and prudence. And I realized something fundamental, that the fear of causing scandal, of ruining reputations, of breaking social norms, was less important than the fear of waking up one day old and alone, having rejected the only opportunity for true happiness that had presented itself to me. Life had already taught me that time does not wait, that opportunities do not repeat themselves, that the people we love can disappear in an instant. And I was wasting the time I had left for fear of what others might think. I made my decision one February morning when snow covered the streets of London and the world seemed stopped. I wrote my resignation, packed my things, and bought a train ticket back to that small town near Ashford Hall. I did not know what I would find upon arrival. I did not know if he would still be waiting for me, if his offer from that last morning had expired with the passing of months. But I knew I had to try, that I preferred to face rejection rather than live the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had been brave enough. I arrived at Ashford Hall at sunset, when the sun stained the sky orange and purple. The house rose against the horizon as always, imposing and silent. I walked along the path leading to the main entrance, with my heart beating so hard I felt my whole body vibrating. I knocked on the door, and it was Mrs. Caldwell who opened. She looked at me with surprise, then with something that might have been approval, and led me inside without asking questions. He was in the library, where he seemed to spend most of his time. When I entered, he looked up from the book he held in his hands, and for a moment he did not seem to believe it. He stood slowly, as if fearing I was an apparition that might vanish. We looked at each other across the space that separated us, and in that moment, no words were needed. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took me in his arms with an intensity that stole my breath. And there, finally, we kissed. A kiss that contained months of waiting, of pain, of denied hope. It was a kiss that promised an uncertain future, but affirmed an undeniable truth, that what we felt was real, was deep, and was worth any price we had to pay. It was not easy. There was scandal, as Lady Margaret had predicted. There were murmurings, disapproving letters from relatives, some friendships that distanced themselves. But there were also people who supported us, who saw in our union not a transgression, but a second chance for 2 people who had known loss and who deserved to know happiness as well. We married in a small ceremony, with Eleanor as our only witness, in the village chapel where I had buried Thomas years before. And when the priest declared us husband and wife, I felt I had finally closed a circle, that I had honored my past without allowing it to define me, that I had found a way to live again without forgetting where I came from. Eleanor grew up happy, surrounded by books and love, and never stopped thanking me for having returned. Ashford Hall ceased to be a house of ghosts and became a home. And I, who had arrived as a governess, simply seeking to survive, found something I had never imagined possible. I found a place where I belonged, where I was loved not in spite of my past, but including it, where each day was an affirmation that love, when it is true, always finds its way. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe and give me your like to continue sharing stories of love born in silence and blooming against all odds.